to introduce readers to the parallax principle. The invisible protagonist of the article is the mysterious Francoist R.L. Chacon, who is obscured by the impressive figure of the anarchist Lawrentius. The art historian whose research is featured in the article cites a small book by Chacon as proof of anarchist torture chambers inspired by avant-garde art. In the book published 7 years after Eisenstein's sojourn in Mexico, the Francoist Chacon claims to reprint the original trial proceedings against Lawrentius, a French anarchist with a Slovene name who was tried for his involvement in the Spanish Revolution when Francisco Franco was reinstalled in 1939. The book presents a series of drawings as copies of original plans drafted by Lawrentius. In one of the plans, a body is enclosed in a rectangular container, forced into a semi-seated pose with knees slightly bent, heels raised, and weight shifted on the toes. The torso rests on a shelf directly under the ribcage. In this position, it is impossible to rest its head. The eyes focus on an opening in the cell in front of the face. A light bulb hangs from outside the cell, and the eyes stare fixedly into its electric heat. After some time, the disoriented body might begin to believe that the light emanates from the optic chasm in his own head, between the back of his eyes and the front of his brain. In Chacon's Lawrentius drawings, the impulse is the opposite of that outlined in Ecstasis. Though the terms of destructive plasticity are the same, anarchist torture of the conservative bourgeois subject is destructive plasticity provoked through a series of restrictions rather than movements. In the article Anarchists in the Fine Art of Torture, Spanish art historian José Milicua claims Chacon's book is evidence that Lawrentius's invention of psychotechnic torture was influenced by modern artists, and names Bauhaus artist Vasily Kandinsky as an example. According to Milicua, Lawrentius's plan for torture cells indicated a preference for the color green. In his 1911 publication concerning the spiritual in art, Kandinsky recounts the process of mixing that produces green. His description is destructive plasticity in color theory. An attempt to make yellow colder produces a green tint and checks both the horizontal and eccentric movement of blue. The color becomes sickly and unreal. The blue, by its contrary movement, acts as a brake on the yellow, and it's hindered in its own movement, till the two together become stationary and the result is green. Similarly, a mixture of black and white produces gray, which is motionless and spiritually very similar to green. But while green, yellow, and blue are potentially active, though temporarily paralyzed, in gray there is no possibility of movement, because gray consists of two colors that have no active force, for they stand, one in motionless discord, the other in motionless negation, like an endless wall or a bottomless pit. Because the component colors of green are active and have a movement of their own, it is possible on the basis of this movement to reckon their spiritual appeal. Green is the most restful color that exists, Kandinsky asserts. And yet, while on exhausted men, this restfulness has a beneficial effect. After a time, it becomes wearisome. In the hierarchy of colors, green is the bourgeoisie, self-satisfied, immovable, narrow. In his account of the article Anarchists in the Fine Art of Torture, Zizek introduces the parallax view with the image of Milicua, a conservative art historian, former chairman of the Prado Museum, looking back on the Spanish Civil War of his adolescence. Milicua reports on a Francoist fantasy of anarchist political aesthetics, an impossible meeting between revolutionary art and revolutionary politics. Milicua never mentions, however, that in Chacon's book, Lawrentius claims to have been an agent of counter-espionage. Chacon concludes his book with a Francoist salute and Lawrentius's final words, "I am the victim of circumstances." A circumstance, rather than a philosophy, is also the way Malabou defines destructive plasticity. As an eventual victim of deconstruction, destructive plasticity, like all of the circumstances of philosophy, will one day disappear from the horizon of generative concepts. For this reason, Malabou insists timeliness is critical. Against the redemptive rhetoric of rehabilitation and flexibility in new liberal biopolitics, Malabou theorizes destructive plasticity as the death drive of cerebral ideology, a causal regime differentiated from sexuality, whose material unconscious underlies the entire structure of an embodied psyche. Sexuality, as defined by Freud, is not sexual relations, but the relationship between the endogenous and the exogenous, the inside and the outside. Similarly, cerebrality is not simply the connectome, varieties of communication among neural networks in the brain. In cerebrality, destructive plasticity is the figure of the death drive that Malabou claims both Freudian and Lacanian dualism failed to theorize, and whose radical political consequences the essentialist monism of contemporary neurology timidly avoids. Malibu's destructive plasticity is a challenge to the naive humanism of neuroscience and counters the all-too liberal economy of the death drive in Freudian psychoanalysis as a kind of, quote, organic elasticity, unquote. Malibu's principal concluding objective, however, is to add the material as a fourth realm to the Borromean knot of Lacanian psychoanalysis, and she actually calls this is the name she gives this fourth realm, the material. The Borromean knot is the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real. For Malibu, this realm of the material needs to produce the figure of an empathetic analyst, capable of performing the invisible suffering of indifferent subjects who have been reduced to the 0 degree of cerebrality, the role I'm playing here. Zizek critiques this assertion as a slip back into the horizon of meaning that betrays the absolute negativity of the destructive plasticity she's theorized. Malibu makes this mistake because she's overlooked that her fourth realm, the material, was already theorized by Lacan in the syntome. The syntome, like Malibu's cerebrality, is the horror vacui, this terror of the nothing that the something, the symptoms expressed by sexuality, keeps the subject from confronting. The post-traumatic subject that Zizek theorizes is pure cerebrality. Malibu's Alzheimer's patient and Zizek's autistic monster are pure reflections of destructive plasticity, of a radical refusal within the organism itself to enact the metaphorization of metonymy demanded by personality. No one thinks spontaneously about a plastic art of destruction, Malibu writes. Yet destruction, too, is formative. Destruction has its own sculpting tools. But in 1918, while he was assisting fellow Cabaret Voltaire artist Emmy Hennings in her performance of Arachne, Hugo Ball was indeed thinking about the plastic art of destruction. He was reprinting Mikhail Bakunin's pseudonymously authored article, A Reaction in Germany. The following year, Ball would choose to reprint only the conclusion of The Reaction in Germany, a proclamation that has since become one of the most frequently quoted slogans associated with anarchism. Translated in English, the conclusion reads, "The passion for destruction is a creative passion too." Like the Francoist R.L. Chacon's Alphonse Laurentić, Bakunin's pseudonymous identity, Jules Elisard, is also a French anarchist. According to historians, Bakunin chose to write the article, The Reaction in Germany, as the reflections of a Frenchman, in order to draw attention to his passage from theory to practice, from Hegelian idealism to materialism, from German metaphysics to French insurrectionism. But just as the pseudonymous authorship of the Bakunin article is often forgotten in its analysis, so is the significant difference between its German original and the English translation. The English iteration of the Bakunin-Elisard slogan notably has the effect of drawing the anarchist side of the destructive plasticity parallax into its new liberal entrepreneurial opposition. The fault for this, perhaps, lies in the process of aestheticization initiated by Ball and continued by fundamentalist individualism across the Atlantic. In 2012, Forbes magazine reintroduced aspiring venture capitalists to Schumpeter's Gale with a lesson in German vocabulary. Schöpferische Zerstörung means creative destruction in German. In America, we've forgotten what it means. Thanks to the Federal Reserve and other destructive creations of government, the process of creative destruction rarely takes root in American soil anymore. But the destructive portion of creative destruction plays a vital therapeutic role. It is precisely this therapeutic spin on plasticity, cited in the Forbes article, between the creative destruction of the venture capitalist and the destructive creation of the parasitic state, that Malibu challenges with her destructive plasticity. Like the Forbes journalist's return to the original German of Schumpeter's Gale, our image atlas concludes with a return to the original German of Bakunin's The Reaction in Germany. In analysis, a temporary autonomous zone for the dialectics of parallax and its politics of refusal is revealed in the brain. Malibu's